Sorry about the late start. I'm happy to introduce Andali Brahman, who is a postdoctoral scholar at Cornell. He's at the Tata Cornell Institute at the Dyson School for Applied Economics. So a lot of us here at CPR have been following his work and the work of his team. Andalib's work is sort of at the intersection of political science and economics. He's been working, well, for a lot of us, what's very interesting, questions of ethnic diversity, segregation, urban segregation, public goods, sort of very core political economy questions that we think of when it comes to caste and religion. Some very, very sort of fundamental measurement questions that Andalib has been working on, and a number of important theoretical insights as well. So I'm very happy to introduce him to this audience and for him to present his paper, Fractal Urbanism. Over to you.
Thanks, Nilanjan, for the kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me here, and everybody at CPR for having me. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here. I've been coming, I know a lot of people here, and I've got the opportunity for the first time because I've been doing other work apart from my work on diversity and development. Primarily, I work on food and agricultural economics. This is a side project which kind of I want to turn into a full-time day job at some point in my life. So yeah, that's about it. And this work, as most of you know by the title of it, is on urban residential segregation, an issue which is something pretty close to my heart because I've always lived my life in urban areas and have seen it through segregated lenses in some ways too. This is a joint work with Naveen Bharti, who's at Harvard, Deepak Malgan, who's at IIM Bangalore, and Sumit Mishra, who's at Kriya University. This is joint work. This basically combines three of our papers, and I'll give you a glimpse of what are we doing in these papers, how we are thinking about it, and where we want to get at it as we progress along these papers. So this is an urban component of our much larger project, understanding diversity in general, be it rural or urban. Since this is CPR and a lot of people I know here work on urban, so I thought it's a good place to present and get feedback upon. So here I would like to start with this poem by the great poet saint Ravi Das. So in these lines, basically Ravi Das tries to imagine a place, tries to imagine a city which he calls Begumpura, where gum is the gham, the Persian word which means sorrow. He tries to imagine a place where there is no sorrow. He tries to imagine a place where there is prosperity, people are rich, they are happy, in some ways everything is right. And if you focus on the last four lines of this thing, you will see that Ravi Das, when he imagines a prosperous place, also imagines prosperity in the place where the son of a tanner, who is Ravi Das himself, can also walk besides the rich and the famous. So he says, they do this or that, they walk along where they wish, they stroll through fabled places unchallenged. Oh, says Ravi Das, a tanner now set free, or those who walk beside me are her friends. So 600 years ago almost, he said about this thing. So just gives us an insight into how a society works where not everybody is equal, not all spaces are equal or equal access provided to space here. And very interestingly, it's very fascinating, the Indian Railways has a train called Begumpura, which goes from from Varanasi to Jammu. And Varanasi is where Ravi Das was born. So this symbolizes what Ravi Das imagined of a place where there's no differentiation, people are all equal. And for the sake of a metaphor or the rhetoric that Ravi Das has, here I want to ask the basic question, which station are we on the road to Begumpura or on the journey to Begumpura? Have we reached there? Is this a journey or is it actually a fable like he tried to position itself? And the other point that I want to highlight, this journey or this travel, while collective, is also very individual. Many of us might live in a world which is some way similar to Begumpura. For some, it's actually, they don't even know such a place exists. So it's very individual also depending on which group one is. When I talk about travel or this journey, there's also another great man in Indian history, B.R. Ambedkar, who exhorted people of lower caste to make this journey. But his idea of this journey from the rural hinterland to the urban cities. In the most famous speech of the Constituent Assembly in 1947, exactly 71 years ago to this date on November 4th itself, he is reported to have said, what is the village but a sink of localism, a den of ignorance, narrow-mindedness, and communalism. So on this journey, he exhorted people to move from rural areas so that the anonymity provided by urban areas gets rid of the prejudices, the discrimination which are rife in a rural setting. So this exhortation to the community of Dalits has a major impact on the psychology of people and the behavior here. There are a number of stories about, for example, Mahars in Maharashtra who migrated to Bombay and Pune in early 19th century to escape the oppressions of the caste system. If you look at the census data in the last 10 years, actually there's been 40% increase in urban areas of the proportion of scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. So this question is rightly posed here in terms of, okay, so does this promise, this normative promise of urbanization particularly and modernization in general to get rid of our identities, probably the social identity mostly, because our class identities would remain salient, that's how things are. So how far are there? Are Indian cities the kind of place that Ambedkar imagined or Ravidas invoked in his poetry? So this is the question. Where are we? I mean, this is a collection of 3 newspaper articles which we saw in the last 1 year, which does talk about the myth of caste-free metropolis. It's based on different contexts. It's a reportage as well as some other data work that's available on this, where people are questioning our cities are highly segregated based upon multiple identity markers. And mind you, I want to highlight these segregation studies are also for cities, the metropolitan cities of India, the major metros. So when one think of India's development process, development has largely come through to the cities, the major cities, and if these places are so spatially segregated based upon certain identity, then it's important to question the distributive aspect of growth, who benefits from the growth, especially when the cities are also so exclusionary and space is not equally distributed across these identity. So the issue is important. I mean, I don't have to highlight much, but I would like to say what I'm going to present to you in the next 40 minutes or so is first I talk about segregation, how to and where to measure segregation actually, because what is segregation? Segregation could be in a classroom to segregation in a country. So what should be the ideal measure? But depending on the question at hand. To answer this question, I will principally use 2 kinds of data set. For the first time, census in 2011 released electoral block level data, within ward data for the first time, which has information on the social composition, which we use to kind of provide some idea of what a neighborhood could look like. Which allows us to move away from studying segregation only in major metropolitan cities, but also in other cities, 147 cities in total, which have a population more than 3 lakh households, which helps us also to test for the idea, in general, that larger cities would have probably lesser segregation or more, so that's an empirical question yet. But this data also is restrictive in some sense because it gives us information on the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and all the other population put together, which may not be how we perceive segregation, or a lot of people perceive segregation when they walk across cities. So we use a much more detailed data, which has greater information on the identity. For Karnataka, this is a specific case. And later on, for the city of Bangalore, I'll show you, I'll provide the first visual description, street level segregation of some sort that we have ever seen. And if I get time, I'll discuss the ongoing work based upon what we are trying to find. So this is the kind of outlay for the presentation. So none of the results that I'll show you is causal. It's just very descriptive thing over which we should ideate around why is it so, or how should we think about it, because we are just presenting the first cut of the data where we've sliced it very differently on parameters we thought are important and could raise important discussion, and that's the whole idea of the R that we have here. Okay, why should we study segregation? For an audience which is studying urban areas, probably not something which is really, I should say, because they know it, but I would like to highlight some of the stark implications of it. All of us have good or bad memory of the neighborhood we grew up. The kind of children we played with, the kind of schools we went to was in some way a function of the neighborhood we grew up. And probably that's how we view life, that's how we think. And our intellectual journey has also been traversed along those lines. So neighborhood for sure has a lifetime impact. Studies on segregation and neighborhood has been happening in the US for a large number of years. Most recently, one of the most important contribution to this area has been by Raj Chetty and co-authors, where they show that some people are poor because they live in segregated neighborhoods. It's intuitive, it's logical, I mean, we understand, but it's important to highlight, and that's Chetty's contribution to say why this is. The reasons why this is so has been talked about in the literature for quite a bit, and one of the thing is, if you're if you live in an isolated co-ethnic neighborhood, and you're also poor of a certain minority group anywhere in the world, you probably have limited exposure to successful people. Not only do you lack the right kind of a network which makes you go better on in life, and the role models to look up, even if they are not your co-ethnic, that affects your aspiration because you don't have inspiration of people around to pursue whatever you would like. So that's one of the reasons why you may not find people who are in isolated co-ethnic poor neighborhoods to succeed much later in life. Philosophically, segregation also means alienation of communities. It means you're not giving everybody the right to enjoy certain parts of the city if they can afford it and would probably want to live there. So it hampers social equity, and in some ways psychologically alienates them also. In times of communal violence, it's especially problematic because you know where ethnic enclaves lie, when histories of riots and of all kinds across the globe know how this, because ethnic enclaves are common, whichever they are. So you know where your targets are, whichever group they are. On the other hand, if neighborhoods are diverse, where you have all kinds of groups, not only does it avoid the problems that I talked about, but also it ameliorates group enemy, because I interact with somebody not of my co-ethnic group on a daily basis, or I play with them. So I know what their cultural practices are, beliefs are. So in some ways that lowers the stereotype which we have of different people, and probably we can communicate and collaborate with them much better. So that's why segregation is important. I thought it's important to highlight. India and studies on urban segregation. It's important. We have had historically a lot of studies, ethnographic accounts. Formal quantitative studies of residential segregation in India have been few and far between. I mean, primarily on account of lack of availability of data. I mean, all of us here who have rented a place in India would know all the markers of why you don't get a rented place somewhere in India, be it your eating practices, your religion, or probably your marital status. All this determine why, all this ultimately leads to why spaces are segregated, and that's how it is. So I should not highlight why urban segregation in India is important, but the point that I want to highlight, and that's the central piece of this whole presentation, is how do we measure segregation? Where do we measure segregation? Current account of segregation in India has mostly used urban wards as the unit of analysis, and the three ethnic categories, which are scheduled tribes, scheduled caste, and others, because that's the information we have. So this is limited not only in ethnic scale, but also in spatial scale. When we talk about segregation, we talk about neighborhoods. So if I ask you, would you consider a ward as a neighborhood you kind of live in currently? It's hard, right? Because wards are big. I'll try to convince you with a lot of pictures why your wards are not your neighborhoods if you're still not convinced. One of the reasons, just if you look at the numbers, average population in urban ward in India is 1,500 to 6,000 people for smaller towns, which increases to as large as 30,000 to almost 2 lakh for metros, probably Delhi, this lab. None of us have so many neighbors. I'm pretty sure about it. On the other hand, the census enumeration block or a sub-block has 125 households, which have an average population of 650 to 70. So that's what we think is a neighborhood. I mean, we're not saying in this whole body of work that we have that's a neighborhood. That's still contentious, but that gives us a much better idea of what could constitute a neighborhood, because these are the people we are more likely to interact. Census enumeration block also, I believe, is a good measure of neighborhood because they're based upon natural boundaries. They follow the standard census practices of a right-hand rule. You start with a survey questionnaire, move on a right hand, then take a turn, keep on, and when you hit a natural break, you kind of stop, and that becomes your census enumeration block. So that is what I think is a neighborhood scale, and much of my results would show you how segregation at the census enumeration block gives you a different picture, a more acute, a more stark, but a more, what I call, a depressing picture of segregation in Indian cities. Look at this. This is probably, we all know Johnny Miller by now. He is one of the guys who used drones to take pictures of Cape Town and showed spatial inequality in the cities. This is one of his work on the city of Bombay. Probably this is the same ward. And the same ward, if you look at class composition of the same ward, on an average, you might find whatever income levels you have or asset level you have. But if you disaggregate by certain streets or other blocks, you will find a very different picture. So if I calculate a metric, any kind of metric, even if it's income, it's going to give me a different thing. So that's one of the arguments that I want to make with this picture. The other argument that I want to make with this picture, if somebody comes and says to all these well-built houses, the sky-rise buildings, 70% of them, if they are occupied by upper castes, and 70% of them, of the blue tarpaulin houses, are being occupied by lower caste. So what does it mean for understanding segregation, especially when your unit of analysis is at the ward level? So that's one of the contention that we want to bring in. I thought this Unequal Scenes by Johnny Miller is a good representation of why we should have good boots on the ground kind of work as well to go with the quantitative segregation which I'm going to present. So 2 points. One, class-based segregation is here. Then there could be potentially a caste-based segregation. Based upon Anirudh Krishna's work, he shows that 70% of the urban slum dwellers in the city of Bangalore are of lower caste people. But if I go to and say this to anybody who lives in Bombay, probably somebody who has lived in Bombay like me for 6 years, I mean, why is this stark? I mean, this is our everyday life. Why should we worry about it? There are lots of reasons why you should be worried about it. I'll tell you as I go. From Bombay to Delhi now, because it's a Delhi audience, I thought it's important to show you what is here. So this place actually is your Malviya Nagar ward, if you can look at more clearly in red. And this Malviya Nagar ward comprises of Jia Sarai, Kalu Sarai, Qutub Enclave, ISI Delhi, IIT, and then you have Sarvapriya Vihar as well. And most of us would know the kind of differentiation by caste, class along these things. Use ward as a unit of analysis, like if I calculate a diversity metric using whatever metric I want, for Malviya Nagar, it's going to give me a very different picture to compare to if I look at diversity in Kalusarai. Kalusarai is in the other ward, Jia Sarai, or Qutub Enclave. Qutub Enclave is probably people who retired from JNU or lived around graduates of JNU and IIT, which all part of the same ward. So that's why it's important to study segregation at a neighborhood level. And what constitutes a neighborhood is actually a question each of us grapple with, because that's all very psychological in terms of what you consider your neighborhood. So this is to give you an example of Delhi. If you're still not convinced, I'll take you to Bangalore. And this is again the portrait from the census data of block level. So these smaller grids are actually the enumeration blocks, and the bigger ones, for example, these ones, the bold lines, are your wards. So within each of these wards, you find so much of heterogeneity. What these numbers represent is the proportion of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. So this is the first picture of such a detailed level of segregation for any Indian cities yet. This was a huge exercise of hand coding actually these block level maps, because they are not available in public. So it's very clear, right? You can see many red dotted places, red dotted lanes, if I can call it now here, are where SC and STs are dominant, while as the color shades go lighter, you have less proportion. So rich households or upper caste households live alongside the poor lower caste households in the same ward. So the diversity metric, or whatever we understand or we should think about a neighborhood, should be contingent on these micro nuances, which till now the extant literature has kind of ignored. So this gives us, so I think by these, so through these three pictures of Bombay, Delhi, and Bangalore, and I'm trying to convince that how should we measure or where should we measure segregation. That's essentially the premise of this whole presentation. So if you've bought this argument, probably you won't gain much into it later. Yeah.
So the question is, what is the logical end of this process? And I think it's something we talked about, right? So imagine that you had households that were geo-village, and you had a distance metric of household to household, and there are ways of aggregating using spatial statistics or network-based measures. To what extent would you be looking at very, very similar sorts of outcomes, and to what extent would you be looking at something different? Let me sort of throw something on the table, right? Which is that our assumption, as you've given us with, I think we would agree that Malviya Nagar ward is far too big, right?
Right.
But let's say I take a Basti, which could be multiple census enumeration blocks. Now, is it clear that you've actually picked up multiple neighborhoods, or are you actually picking up a scale that at times is too small for the neighborhood and is actually measuring something that is sort of more than neighborhood level segregation?
Right.
And of course, the standard sort of spatial critique is that are these boundaries meaningful? Which is to say that if you didn't use boundary level measures, would these colors be a lot more smoothened out as opposed to sort of
right.
So I mean, I was wondering if you just comment a little bit on how much work you think the boundary is doing in your measures as opposed to what we might sort of abstractly measure segregation.
Right. Okay. So I would say wards are an administrative unit, a political unit. So they don't have any social meaning. I mean, they may have because of the political construct around it. So that's a problem. That's why we're moving to finer level. Yeah, it's lanes or whatever streets are also not uniform. I mean, our cities are not like European or American cities where clearly laid out straight lines, and they're natural barriers as well. So this is again an administrative construct. The enumeration block is an administrative construct by the census department to measure this. Yeah, that's also a problem. What we are doing here is saying if you use this is a problem. Streets are also very different. I mean, my neighbor, so I may be talking to my neighbor on the right and probably at the back where I share a wall, but I don't have a window, I may not know the person's existence. So that's a problem. So to answer your question and the critique also, we are also critiquing of this also in our later work where we are thinking of identifying a neighborhood through some kind of a programming where you have a sequence of households where probably co-ethnics, and then suddenly the sequence breaks. It's like a genomic sequence. And then one can calculate, that could be one measure, because how do we come across as a very, very precise measure for a concept which is very psychological, right? Neighborhood itself.
Would that the boundaries of neighborhood are the same?
Not necessarily, but could be too. I mean, if it's a lake cutting across or some natural boundaries coming, so then it becomes. But there could be no, and there's also filled up. So I mean, I grew up in Patna. I can tell you of many of these nalas have been filled up, and all the motorable vehicles go, which were very clearly demarcated spatial boundaries where you don't cross across them. But now the completely has gone away. So those are natural boundaries, of course. And then you have gated communities, which will create boundaries, which probably in enumeration block may not have captured now, but in 2021 there would be a gated community coming in, and there would be a wall around it. So that's a major problem. I mean, to give you an example, something different, from Jaffarlow's book on segregated Muslim societies in Juhapura. So Juhapura, I don't know if most of you know, is a place which kind of got re-established after the riots in Gujarat, where many of the Muslims who were living there, a lot of Muslims came in, a lot of rich Muslims came in there. So now you have many BMWs and Mercedes there. But most of them were poor Muslims there. So within Juhapura, it's probably one ward, there's so much of other class-based distinction. And I'm sure these gated communities which have come up would create some kind of boundaries. So it's also a process which evolves depending on the socio-political realities of the place around. So I mean, your criticism is valid. We are working with what we have, but that's, we are thinking about it in a. You're right. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't want to. But I mean, I think there's an argument to be made for the neighborhood model, right? The question ultimately is: do you believe that people are interacting within defined boundaries that look like neighborhoods, or are they interacting across neighborhood boundaries, and the boundaries are not providing as much information as we think they are? Right.
So right. So for that, I don't have an answer. But that's a homophily argument that you have, right? I think Raheel Datiwala, she did a field study in Ahmedabad where she actually asked who do you talk to in terms of an immediate neighbor or some relative, like in the next lane or something. Yeah, that requires, as I said, boots on the ground kind of work, because normal surveys, it's hard to identify those kind of things. Yeah. So all India snapshot. So what I'll do is first start with 5 big cities of India and then go on to talk about the 147 cities for which we have this neighborhood which we think is a neighborhood, which not a precise, but yet. So just reassuring that the cities in India follow the standard Zipf's law. If you rank by population and city ranks, they follow the standard linear power law equation. We have 147 cities. In total, there are 10,000 wards, 3 lakh enumeration blocks, sorry. So just reassuring to find them, they follow the Zipf's law, where all the unit of analysis do represent an urban unit of analysis. That's the idea of it. If you look at population distribution, so on your left is the ward. there's so much of difference across these 5 cities in the number of median ward population as well as the number of wards. So if you look at Bombay, Bombay has huge size of the ward. There are only 97 wards in Bombay, while Delhi has 289 wards. The size is not that much of different. I mean, it's not thrice the other city. Kolkata has 141 wards. Population size also differs. Bombay is highly dense. We all know median ward population therefore is also different. And that is the distribution. Bombay is an outlier. At the enumeration block, you actually have much more uniformity on your right. Bangalore has 528 households on an average in a median, which is the median block population. Mumbai has 460. So the variation is actually a little less because blocks are more uniform, and blocks are also something which are not gerrymandered, which wards are depending on it. So if somebody wants to track over time, or the census department wants to track over time, probably enumeration ward blocks are a better measure because wards will be subdivided for a variety of reasons. So the message behind this is wards are different from enumeration block. They're more precise, they're more accurate, they give us a better picture of the neighborhood. To get a sense of, in the metropolitan cities, what's the share of scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. Kolkata has only 5% of scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. Bombay has around 7.5. Delhi has 15% scheduled caste and tribes, but all of them are scheduled castes. So the census enumerates scheduled tribes based upon the state list of tribals. Delhi doesn't. In the Delhi state list, tribe population is not there. So that's why you have 0 as the city population, but overall it has 15% of the population summation SC and ST. Chennai has 17, a little larger than in the 4-5 metropolitan cities. So this gives a snapshot of what data we are working with. Segregation metrics, standard dissimilarity metrics, which basically measure the evenness of distribution across these different levels. So what dissimilarity measure does is to ask what percentage of people should be moved from one ward to the other or one enumeration block to the other to make them uniform to the level of the ward or the city, which is our normative metric. We use this to calculate for the 5 cities for India. The first column is the ward to city segregation level, which is the standard practice, which is what you will find till now. So it says 23% of the people, SCs and STs in Bangalore need to be moved to other wards to make it uniform across the city. Numbers are highest for Calcutta, which had the lower proportion of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. So Calcutta is followed by Delhi and Chennai, which have the equal number, then Bangalore and then Bombay. But as I said, this is probably not the most precise measure of segregation. Move to column 2, which is block to city, which is higher. Of course, blocks are going to be different from the city tautologically because they're much more smaller units. So the numbers multiply by almost a factor of 2, but they kind of show the same trend. The important one is actually the third and the fourth column, where you have the median block to ward segregation, because once I can convince you that it's a street level of the neighborhood or the enumeration block, which is the important unit of segregation you should do, then we compare it to the ward that in concert. So that's what we should look at. So here again, we find the segregation metric to be much higher, which is almost twice the size that we'll get if we have ward as a unit of analysis. And the trend is pretty clear. Kolkata is followed by, again, Bombay now comes in higher, which it was not. So Bombay, you can see now, the streets are much more segregated, but wards were not so much. So this is one of the results. Then if I use Gini, that's the inequality in the share of SC/ST distribution across the ward and the block. So this one is your the Gini coefficient of the block, and this is of the ward. Of course, the block level inequality would be higher. So if you look at Kolkata here, almost 60% of the enumeration blocks do not have a single SCs or ST. The number is a little lower in Bangalore, but the difference between the ward and block is higher for Bangalore. So there's a different characteristic of the city. I mean, all of these cities are go back pretty long in time, and there are reasons how they were before the colonial rule and after the colonial rule shaped, and now how the business and politics shapes all these cities. So this basically again gives the same idea that how they are different. Another measure for diversity to be measured across these settings is a fractionalization metrics, which basically means what's the probability if you pick 2 random people that they are of the same ethnic group or whatever your ethnic markers. So you can see that in pink, I have the enumeration block, and in blue it's the ward level diversity. Wards are pretty diverse, but enumeration blocks are not. So all of us in some ways are living in isolated silos because we live on one enumeration block, which is part of the ward. So this again conveys the same message. On the right, this larger picture is of the whole 147 cities. It's not only these 5 cities, but all these cities with a population of 3 lakh plus have this problem where you have huge variation in terms of the proportion of their Cs and Sts. These are just the distribution plots of the dissimilarity index. You can clearly see Calcutta is towards the right, Bangalore is kind of somewhere in the middle, Delhi, Mumbai is also to the right, this distribution plot, I think. So does what size has something to do with segregation? Should we expect more bigger wards to have greater segregation? That's one of the questions. We do it for the 5 cities. We don't find a clear trend, so there's no pattern here. So this leads me into now a little more detailed study on 147 cities. This was 5 cities. If you look at here, I've just aggregated by states, which probably doesn't represent the state in a whole because all states are differently urbanized in terms of their population, but some trends you can see. You can see that Bihar is uniformly distributed. Chandigarh actually should not have been there because it's only urban, so it doesn't give us Jammu and Kashmir gives us a bimodal kind of a distribution. If you look at Uttar Pradesh, again has a bimodal. There are plenty of people who are kind of very, very isolated. Then you have a uniform distribution, and so on and so forth. This is what Gini also gives us a similar picture, different measure, but intuitively answers the same question. Now I try to convince why ward block and different, and the question of normative of urbanization is kind of becoming weaker here because we are not finding cities to be as inclusionary as Ambedkar or Ravidas would have imagined at points in history. So the question is, does the city size have something to do with the neighborhood segregation? So this is what I come to this in this slide. So what on the x-axis you have the population growth of cities between 1961 to 2011, and this on the y-axis is the median dissimilarity index. We do find a slight negative trend, but we don't know exactly, do larger cities actually have lower segregation? Yeah. So this is from the census town directory. So as they have enumerated city and they're kind of calculated.
Because the reason I asked is city expand.
Right.
Bangalore might have a lot of rural areas that is inside. So when you compare that with Calcutta, which has really expanded over time, I'm not really sure that comparing.
No, so that's one of the concerns. That's why I don't rely fully on this picture, because essentially that's very true in terms of how much of agglomeration has happened, how much of rural areas have they eaten up. So yeah, well taken. So, but I'll show you another picture which is even more stark. Is this? This is on your x-axis is your city rank in terms of the population. On your y-axis is your difference between the ward and the block Gini of the diversity metric, and it's a flat line. It's a complete flat line, which basically means if you live in Delhi or if you live in Kanpur or Trichy, probably the segregation is as acute. Within what segregation? Again, questions the normative idea of urbanization, modernization in general. So where are we in terms of our urban process? So this is the picture. I disaggregate by different states, and probably the trends are not so clear. It's mostly a flat line where segregation has nothing to do with the size of the ward of the city that it is in. To make our point even more compelling, here you have city fractionalization, which is the diversity metric on the x-axis, and city ward dissimilarity index difference on the y-axis. Both of them, and here you have the ward and block dissimilarity index on the y on the graph on your right. So both of them are almost flat lines.
Can you look at the city rank graph?
Yeah, this one.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah.
So what is this bottom? What is the x-axis? Log city rank.
Log city rank. So basically, to make it more. So Bangalore is one, not Bangalore. I mean Bombay, Delhi are one of the metropolitan cities with the top 5, and then the rest of the cities. So these are all 147 cities in India, which have a population more than 3 lakhs. So this is basically in some ways your population. Just that gives us an easy idea if we do a rank rather than the population number actually, because there's much more variation there.
One of the things that, I mean, I don't know if it's going to work out. It looks like the variation is growing towards the end of, like, right,
Right.
I rank.
Right. So yeah, I mean it's Trichy and Kanpur. Then you compare Indore, probably Chandigarh, and then it's Delhi, Bombay, Hyderabad.
So I'm just wondering, is that it's not that they're. I wonder if there's the real variation is about the question of how the largest cities are organized rather than the size of the cities themselves.
And what
Right?
would
Because I'm just wondering, because that's where the variation on the graph looks. I'm just blindly looking at the graph. I don't know what it looks like. Right. It just looks like the variation is highest right at the end of that distribution, right?
Right. So there's a big cluster there rather than on the
it's going very low and very
yeah.
high.
Yeah.
And so I agree that the mean curve is flattish, right? But in some sense, that's hiding the fact that what this graph is really telling us is that there's variance in variance, right?
Yeah, one can slice it. I mean, probably those are some other state which are clustered in the middle or at the bottom.
Because you have more points at the end. The distribution around the end has narrower because it's a mean curve. Your distribution is narrower because it's the confidence interval around the mean. But it's not telling you the actual variation of the points, right? Which is high.
So do you think if I do the population numbers, it should solve some problem? Instead of the ranking, if I do population, because
maybe that will do something, right? But also, that's a crazy.
Because then on the right there'll be a similar thing, because right tail would be thin. All the 5 metropolitan cities would come in, and then you have this.
Exactly. So
won't solve the
is there something that you can come up with that's going to break that piece at the end, right? It just strikes me there's way too much variation on your measure, right?
Probably if I remove the metros, the tier 1 city, I mean the million plus cities, maybe, and then check it. That's a valid point. Probably, that's great actually. Okay, so again, it's a flat line, no matter how big your ward is. Probably the segregation metrics say that you are living in a segregated space. Okay, so this was very useful in terms of giving us an idea of how segregated our spaces are depending on scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, and other population. But that's a limitation, right? I mean, most of our cities have been established historically for different reasons. For example, if I take the example of Bangalore was established by the ruler based upon the Kempegoda, based upon different petes. And these petes were doing different kind of trading. So you have Kaban pete, which does very different thing, from Kumbar pete, which does pottery, to some other pete where weavers were there. So these were different. Of course, they were not wards. They were settled differently. And then in the colonial rules, the British established cantonment, which led to a different kind of population of people being there or attracting from outside. So the ethnic scale argument is very important. It's not only the geographic scale, which is what we do with this Karnataka data. So this data comes from a very detailed survey conducted by the Karnataka government, which is actually a census scale survey, which covers every individual in the state of Karnataka, which has almost 5 million urban households. The coverage rate is almost 100% except for Bangalore, where 91% of the people were covered. And to make it a little more credible, I was just saying to Nilanjan, I'm one of the respondents of the survey. So I know what questions do they ask, how they ask. They asked very detailed information on jati, the amount of land you held, or religion you belong to. So this threw up the whole survey, because when Naveen, my collaborator, was a part of the survey design. So there were 2,500 jati names, which is the first of its kind of exercise since 1931 in India. Of course, there were many orthographic errors which the survey reported, because if I belong to a Jat community, I'll say Jat, some might say Jaat, some might say Jat, some might say something else. So it took a lot of time to first harmonize them orthographically, then actually what do these jati name meant? Are they endogamous jatis? So we were left with 1641 jatis, which were further coded into 700 very distinct historically endogamous categories based upon published historical anthropological accounts, colonial census accounts, canonical literature of in the Kannada literary canons, and discussion of a lot of anthropologists in the state of Karnataka. And all of them were ultimately collapsed into around 741 caste categories. This coding exercise, as you would understand, took almost 2 years. So what this allows us to actually now calculate a lot of these metrics at a more finer level, not only geographically, but also at the ethnic scale. 7 or 8 categories. So it's important to highlight here, Karnataka has a very distinct way of categorizing the SC, ST, OBC, and others that we understand largely for affirmative action, but Karnataka it's a little different. So they have an 8 group thing where you have scheduled tribe, scheduled caste, which basically concurs with the central list, but they have category 1, which is nomadic and semi-nomadic caste, which include SC Christians, then category 2A, which are traditional occupation people like weaver, washerman, potter, etc. Category 2B is Muslims. 3A and 3B are the most landholding castes in Karnataka. And others are probably mostly the upper caste people. So it's a little different. What we do is use these 8 categories, match those 708 categories to these 8 administrative categories because they're more politically salient to actually measure these diversity metrics, which I showed you earlier. To talk more about the survey, it also contains very detailed information on education, land held by the people, demographic information for every individual, even noisy income data, whether they have electricity, sanitation, provisioning, etc., and the kind of education they have attained and what their kids do. So all of this is mapped. In addition, we have the caste, religion, language, and the class axis as well. So it's quite a comprehensive data set to measure many of these things. Instead of the dissimilarity index, which we use for the census scale observation, we use a divergence matrix, which is a recently developed metric by a PhD student at Yale, which is a better measure when we have more than 2 groups, because the similarity index was only 2. This is more. And this also is important if you want to decompose, because I told you that wards and enumeration blocks are different. It's important to decompose them into 2 different things to actually understand the extent of segregation. So this measure allows us to do, which we use for 5,481 urban wards in Karnataka. And the microdata allows us to characterize people based upon different groups. Again, Zipf's law is a standard thing. Everybody's kind of convinced that it follows the Zipf's law. Blue color is the Bangalore. So you can see the largest city has the largest sized wards. So clearly convincing on this. Divergence index is not the same as fractionalization of the diversity metric index. As we can clearly see, the blue dots are basically Bangalore, which at points has the highest, as wards which are more diversified, but not to the same level as the town they are in. So this confirms that these metrics are different. They mean very different things. Now the number, what's the segregation index for these things? So look at this. So these are the 8 group things. Nomadic and semi, the first column is basically how many percentage of these populations are urban. So this uses also the rural data, because how would we know the population? Muslims are 38% urbanized of the soul of Karnataka, which is just marginally less than Brahmins and other upper caste, which is 43%. They are most urbanized. This gives also a sense of who are urbanized actually. The lowest urbanization rate is among scheduled tribes, understandably, followed by scheduled castes, and then you have semi-nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes, followed by traditional occupation castes. The landholded castes, of course, they're almost 25% local, because landed elites are largely rural. Urban landed elites are of very different kinds. Column 3, mean block fraction diversity metrics, you can see is kind of high. Highest diversity metric is 0.72. This is the block level. Vocaligas 3A has 0.72, but there's not a lot of difference there. Mean ward fractionalization also you can see. But the last one is the important one, where we see that Muslims has 0.32. So 32% of the Muslims need to be displaced across these enumeration blocks to make the city uniform. That's the essential premise of this number, which means they are the most segregated, followed by scheduled castes, which is 0.3. The rest are a little less, around 0.25. So this is one of the first portraits of actually Muslim segregation in India. I mean, we're following up on the accounts of Chris Jaffalo and others who have done an anthropological study on it, but this is probably the first of it.
How do these measures account for the proximity of, let's say, Muslim majority blocks being next to each other? So you can imagine
right.
your multiple wards that are all, so that you have actually a large Muslim ghetto.
Right.
I don't know what this picture looks like, and not. I don't think this measure actually is that you could have those blocks being all across the city or next to each other, and the measure would be the same. Right?
Yes. So this basically says how GSRI is different from Malviya Nagar, not that GSRI is next to Qutub Enclave or Sarve Priya Vihar. So that's essentially a question, which is actually should be a much more refined way of thinking about it. Yeah. Yeah, this is very agnostic to space actually. This is horizontally the space. It talks about vertically how you are kind of ensconced into the other. And that's why I talk, I mean, sorry, I should have told earlier, why are we talking about this in a fractal sense? Why are you saying fractal urbanism? Because the fractal dimension basically means one can disaggregate a space into multiple dimensions. They should look similar. And that's what it's not. It's not even. It's the whole Indian urbanism is characterized by so much of unevenness, and this is what we are trying to show through multiple ways and means. Depending on the size of the ward, segregation actually doesn't change, whichever group you are. So this is city rank and segregation of different caste groups. They're not very different, so everybody is segregated, not a function of the size of the city they live in. Now this is interesting. So this is segregation by caste. So who is most segregated? I showed that Muslims at 0.32, the highest segregation metrics, followed by SCs, which were 0.3. So here Muslims 2B and SC are the only ones which have a bimodal distribution, which implies either they only live with people like them, or they are living in a mixed neighborhood, which most of the other groups are. So clearly the blip on the right, on the left for 2B and SC represents the kind of isolated living that these two groups are into, and this is quite starking. Yeah.
So the list of SCs and STs that you consider here, the jatis and the subjatis, is that the same that census used, or is that a different list?
It's the same list. Yeah. I mean, there's a great deal of concordance in the census and the state list, but for some groups, state and center do it differently.
Because I would assume that's not endogenous, right? Which jati goes into the SC and ST lists, because there must be political considerations there. Whether a jati is pooled in an SC and ST group. So I'm assuming that the census's list of what they consider SCs and STs in the state of Karnataka.
Yeah, it's based upon that.
And these are consistent. The two lists from the census and the one that you have are consistent.
Yeah, they're largely consistent, except for some groups which might have petitioned the state for some extra affirmative. Like, there are many examples of different groups which are SCs in one and probably OBCs in the other. They are such as well. So this is very consistent with how Karnataka government sees its people. I mean, these codings are also a result of how government, like the whole Gujar demand of being enlisted in the STs, or the Marathas demanding themselves to be listed as OBCs, are also state specific too. So this is consistent with how the government sees its people, because it's Karnataka. So probably I don't have the most appropriate answer for you, but it's consistent with how government records work. Okay, segregation by caste groups. This is the ward level, but the important word was the electoral block level, which completely shows isolation, which is not clearly coming through that starkly when I use a ward, but still it's there. Does it matter by the city size, the spatial divergence? If I do by city fractionalization index or divergence index, again a flat line largely. We don't see that size of the ward or city has something to do with the degree of segregation. If I go to within ward segregation and city size, again a flat line. Yeah.
So I meant to ask this to your
Sure.
previous section also. What we know a lot about the migration tree from the literature is that it's along caste lines, and to the extent that city sizes are becoming bigger because of more migration coming to the city. Are you saying that even though what we know about migration is that it's along caste lines, they're not necessarily living in the same locations in the city where those castes exist? Because so assume that a caste C comes from village to a city and stays in the same space as the caste used to stay earlier, then there should be greater sort of pooling of similar castes together in the same ward or a block.
Yeah.
But you're not picking that up. So how does that?
Because I'm just giving you a snapshot of what exists now. I don't know which city people moved or who moved from one ward to the other ward. That's not something which I am talking about. I don't have data on that. This is just a snapshot. I mean, with this, we are trying to encourage a lot of field-based work where you'll actually find how these places have changed. So I don't have an answer because there's absolutely migration data is anyway scarce at the city level too. I mean, this is even at the ward level. So that's that's a great question, but data limitations. Yeah, it's a flat line again, depending on the size of the city or segregation of the board. There's absolutely no connection. It's equally highly segregated and equally highly segregated. So now I'll show you some maps on how Bangalore, the Silicon Valley of India, and how segregated it is, which will probably give you, people who know Bangalore probably better than me will have much more to say than what I have too. This is the city of Bangalore, and these maps are enumeration block maps. And here, in blue are, in purple here, are the places which have less than 4% of the SC/ST population, and they are quite high. And somebody who knows why there's so much of dense on the right-hand side, it's the white field. They're probably ITPL, where lots of IT jobs are there. So it questions in some way who are getting the kind of jobs which are available in the city and what demographic composition it has. So if you remember the Bombay map which I showed you, if think it's a white field is similar to that. And this is not similar, sorry, I am wrong actually. Whitefield is mostly 25-year-olds who live in those kind of buildings, and there are hardly slums around. But this gives you a portrait of scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, which are less than 4%. Even if I aggregate to 10% or less, this is how it looks like. I mean, all of you will probably have your own take on this. Diversity. So diversity at the block level. This uses the 717 Jati categories that we have. It still shows which are more diverse. The central part of Bangalore, which has historically been there for a long time of the city. So outgrowth of the city, something where your question might fit in, because migrants come in and live in outgrowth of the cities. They are probably less diverse. So could be, I mean, posing a hypothesis, I don't know. And the north part where the airport is, least diverse. So this is how the city looks like. Diversity by Jati level. So yeah.
What's the metric shown in the legends?
So this is the divergence matrix which I just showed. So just imagine the white ones where there's, so the black ones where very little diversity. So there's streets or neighborhoods where you don't find anybody but your own Jati, which is a potter is finding only potter, a Brahmin is finding only Brahmins, which is scary too, because then the kind of silos we live in, and if neighborhood effects persist for a lifetime, probably it affects our psyche, our lifetime beliefs of how the world works too. This is the Jati diversity thing. Religion-based diversity. Again, you can see much of the diversity is again at the center, which is the old historical town of the city, where you have mixed neighborhoods, you have scheduled castes living with scheduled tribes, with Muslims, and the markets are there. So the central market of Bangalore, which is full of these people, and also the flower market, which is also in the central part. So diversity there is a little higher, but outgrowth of the city, a little more sobering story. Even if I look at diversity less than 0.1, these are the areas which come into picture, and yeah, red spots. So takeaways from this is the first ever portrait of residential segregation at a neighborhood scale, if I can call it a neighborhood scale. The message that we want to convey across with this is that it requires a lot more understanding, boots on the ground kind of work to actually understand what segregated places look like, how ethnic space making happens. It's independent of the level of urbanization at the ward level or at the city level. For scholarship and practice, I mean, if I go to any policy maker, they'll say, okay, I mean, what the new thing? I mean, we all know we live like this, so what to do? But I think for scholars or even for practitioners, it's important to think deeper about the issue, because it helps us think through how ethnic spaces are created, how ethnic enclaves are created, and what does it mean in general. In general, for something what Partho, Michael Walton, and Patrick Heller would say a cabal city. In some way, it's also a reflection of how cabal city is formed or is sustained. It also helps us question the citizenship or the right to the city of people, how we negotiate the state or people in general. And most importantly, it definitely has the potential political implication of who gets along with whom and how our stereotypes are formed, how our beliefs about politics is formed. I mean, homophilia, group anomie, who should I get along with this, who should not, also are results of how these ethnic spaces are created and probably sustained for a longer period of time and generated over time in history at different points in time. I want to come back to Ravidas, so it's a sobering story, it's a sobering tale, but the train is still on, so we are somewhere there, we'll reach there at some point. City Without Sorrow should be realized at some point. Future work. Do you have time?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so the future work. So these segregation metrics and all actually don't know who lives in these segregated metrics, right? So here all these A to F are equally diverse and segregated spaces. But just think of these colors represent different colors, colors represent different jatis or religion. Probably the dynamics are very different. An ST living in a Muslim neighborhood or a Muslim living in a Brahmin neighborhood or a Dalit living in a Brahmin neighborhood convey very different meaning for the ethnic space where people interact on a daily basis. It also has very different implications of how people get into contact with each other, and their social networks are formed, their life experiences are formed. So this is where we are kind of getting into, which you had initially asked, do actually these people talk to each other? That's the affinity. We are thinking of calculating an affinity matrix where we kind of know who gets in contact with whom, because that allows us to test how these social networks or in some kinds of associations with people affects life outcomes in general, or probably over time, the Kratchety kind of a work. That's one. Microsegregation, because wards are again, census enumeration blocks are again probably not the best metric, as we have talked about, and the fractal urbanism hypothesis needs to be tested at even finer scale, which will further allow us to characterize how contact happens, how residential segregation increases or decreases, how is formed. Spatial aggregation is important. Ethnic aggregation I just showed you. Do they overlap? So is there a class composition to it? Because I just didn't talk about any class angle to the whole perspective. And religion, I mean, I just showed you diversity based upon these religions, but probably in our major cities, religion-based segregation is as rife as anything else. Only yesterday I was talking to a friend, and she mentioned to me, if you're a lawyer and a journalist and a woman who's unmarried and probably a Muslim, forget about living in Delhi. So these are kind of, they even look at your occupation. So she was first asked, are you a journalist or a lawyer? And she, being a journalist, was said, no, please. Despite all the other characteristics being right, maybe. So, I mean, this is a common place, right? I mean, when I was renting a house in Bangalore, I'll always take my mother along with me, because they'll have much more, I'll be more credible, because there's an older lady around. If a single man going to find a house hard, so I'll take my mother along. So these are the kind of things we do, and that also, in some ways, we normalize the kind of segregation, which is some way of microaggression, right? I mean, it's exclusion of places to people, and that questions how urban areas are formed and urban behavior is formed in general. So that's one of the other thing that we want to get to it. We do have controls for non-ethnic variables, which could allow us to test for cohort analysis, mobility, and who in urban areas are benefiting from the fruits of growth, and fractal segregation. We are in the process of actually collecting electricity meter reading of every household in Bangalore to identify this diversity, or which areas are better served in terms of electricity, water. We also are trying to get the Bangalore bus connectivity network, so which streets are better served through piped water as well as bus networks, and the other establishments. So these are the kind of works we are in progress. We are trying to collect to give us a good idea of what urban segregation in India looks like. Yeah, thank you.
Quick question, I'll throw it out to the group. Get the technical question out of the way. So, how many census enumeration blocks do you have, let's say, for Bangalore?
Census enumeration block, Bangalore has 71 wards, and if 400, yeah, it's around 5,400 something.
So, what I'm wondering, so I think your next step actually is to go beyond, because you can geo-reference your census enumeration block at least by giving a center of mass. Right? You may not be able to geolocate households, but it is important to know whether a Muslim block next to a Muslim block is behaving the same way as a Muslim block next to a Hindu block next to a Christian. Right? And that can be easily done by integrating. I mean, there are already off-the-shelf measures that take this kind of stuff and address the complication that is just by thinking about spatial distance between points. So in other words, you would see a higher level of effective segregation if Muslim blocks are only next to other Muslim blocks.
Right. So it's not contiguity of household, but contiguity of blocks.
Exactly.
So if I'm with yeah, that's great.
So I think, I mean, my own sense is that even there, and even the last set of maps you showed us with Jati and religion, show that there are contiguity effects
Very much, yeah.
in the data, right?
Yeah.
And so it strikes me that that is the next obvious place to go with it. detail of data that you have. So
Right.
the advantage of census enumeration work, even if it's not the household level, there are enough where you can
Yeah,
start getting these kinds of. And as it turns out, computational speed really going beyond 5,000, 6,000, you're not going to really want to do anything, right? So.
Definitely, that's a good idea. Because there's a lot of literature around this where crime happens. They say that it happens at the precipice of two different ethnic groups living there because nobody wants to own, and it's probably the more contested. So yeah, it's a
And I think
great
it'll
idea.
also give more explicit results on the public good story. Does
Correct.
that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's one would suspect.